And that's, of course, with your permission, Nina. We'll probably end up putting it.
With a H.
Okay, Rabbi, it's recording now.
Oh, we want to just wait a second. Let's hold on. Welcome, one and all. I'm Rabbi Glazer. It's wonderful to be able to welcome you for this inaugural session of Maven Monologues. It's a chance for us to be able to learn fascinating stories, untold legends, and biographical nuggets from members of our extended Jewish family here at Shar Zion. And we're very excited to be able to welcome a friend and member of the community, Nina Shiff, who came to Canada from the Philippines in 1967, working in Ontario for many years, and then when she came to Montreal and to Quebec, working at the Jewish General Hospital for over 15 years, spent half a century working as a nurse, specifically in cardiology. It's an interesting story that she may touch on of her friendship with Rabbi Frank at the Jewish. Then, of course, she met Lou, her Beshert in 1977, and then with her relationship and studying with Rabbi Langer in the 80s, and a relationship with the community, has been a longstanding member of the Beth-El and now the Shar Zion community. And so we're very, very excited to be able to invite Nina to share with us this first of our Maven monologues, and would ask everyone, if you can, please just remain on mute until we come to the question and answer period. If you have specific questions that you're thinking about, you can actually type them into the chat box, and Nina will be looking at them, as well as Andy and I, during her presentation. There will be time for questions, so please let Nina finish her presentation. And as I mentioned, if you can stay on mute, that would be wonderful. And to get things rolling, Nina, I wanted to just ask you if you could maybe tell us about the mystery of the relationship, the untold story of the 12 to 1300 Jews, apparently, who were saved during the Shoah by the Philippine government. What is it that is unique about this story, and why do we know so little about it? Tell us some of this untold story, if you will. Thanks, Nina.
It is different from the other Shoah stories in that it is very uplifting, very heartwarming, instead of the sad, horrible things that usually are connected with Shoah stories. And the fact that it is happening in Asia as opposed to in Europe or in North America, that makes it a little bit unique.
And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what it was that actually happened for those of us that don't have that window into history, just so we can get a sense of why this is an important story and how you came to discover it, and what you would like us to know about this as we move on in our daily lives together.
That will be part of my presentation, and so it will be, I think, add more to the interest of the story that I'm going to tell, because it's not really a presentation as much as a story of what happened in Asia that I am going to be telling you guys.
Terrific. So without further ado, we welcome you. We're all ears. We're listening now to your story. Thanks, Nina.
Okay, so I call this presentation Making It to Manila. So thank you, Rabbi Glazer, for your introduction, and good afternoon to all. I was asked to do a rerun of a presentation I made at the Côte St. Luc Men's Club for the Shar Zion congregation this time, albeit in an abbreviated form. So if you're also a member of the Côte St. Luc Men's Club, please bear with me as I try to make it as interesting and as cohesive as before. And I repeat, my only claim to being knowledgeable in what I am about to present is based on what I remember from my high school history class, by my being of Filipino ancestry and my interest in the ties that bind the Philippines and Israel. What I am about to present today is actually a very heartwarming story, a story of a deep and improbable international friendship between the Philippines and the Jewish nation as they both struggled, endured, and eventually prevailed against overwhelming odds. It was this friendship and what it meant that I shall explore with you this afternoon, and what its relevance is today. I shall take you back to 1933, when there was unrest in Europe and we're half a world away in Asia. There was also oppression and discontent. In fact, I may even take you as far back as the late 16th century, in the 1500s, when a handful of Maranos settled in the Philippines in order to escape the Spanish Inquisition. The earliest documented Jews in the Philippines, by the way, were two Marano brothers who were recorded as residing in Manila in 1590. They were caught, tried, and convicted by the Spanish Inquisition. The Philippines, unfortunately, was not a safe haven for Jews then. And then we will fast forward to 1935 when the Nuremberg laws came into being, where Europe for the Jews was not a place to be anymore. And then we will touch briefly on the 1938 event that became the flashpoint for a lot of Jews to leave their homeland. And while all of these events were happening in Europe, we will share the sentiments being expressed by the Filipinos and juxtapose them to those expressed by the rest of the world. We will marvel at the cultural makeup of the Filipino people, their innate characteristics that were also present in the then president of the Philippine Commonwealth that propelled him to offer refuge to the Jews when other countries would not. I will talk about the specific person in the Philippine political arena who risked his career and his own personal fortune to do what he said was just the right thing a human being should do. But where I find the most excitement in this story is in the what ifs. What if the political players involved were able to complete their plans? What if they were able to actually settle the 300,000 or so Jews they were planning on saving? What if the Americans did not oppose the plans? What if most of those saved opted to make the Philippines their home? One can only imagine. But on with my story. It was 1933, and there was social unrest in Europe. There was a leadership vacuum that Adolf Hitler easily filled. He was charismatic and full of promise. He knew what was good for Germany, the intelligent Aryan race. He also knew what had to be gotten rid of, and one of the groups he identified as unwanted were the Jews. What followed then from the years 1933 to 1935 was a steep rise in anti-Semitism. In 1935, the annual Nuremberg rally of the Nazi Party resulted in the Nuremberg Laws, a collection of openly anti-Semitic laws and policies which emphasized Aryan racial purity and excluded Jews from their German professional and civic life. Jews were also summarily deprived of their German citizenship and its attendant rights. And as Nazi power grew, anti-Semitic campaigns intensified, erupting on November 9, 1938, Kristallnacht, an orgy of anti-Semitic violence which marked a decisive point in the Holocaust. Many historians consider it the beginning of the final solution era of Nazi power and the turning point for every Jew in Europe. It was a complete material, financial, and social annihilation. Kristallnacht spurred many Jews to make the painful decision to leave their homes and seek safety abroad. Staying behind and hiding was a poor option. Their best hope was escape, but escape to where? Few countries around the world were willing to allow Jewish refugees to take shelter, even on temporary visas. This problem was exacerbated by Nazi policies which systematically stripped immigrating Jews of their wealth. They had to leave behind major personal and professional assets as they sought shelter in places where there might be little or no expectation of economic opportunity. And to make matters worse, the Nazis severely restricted the amount of money immigrating Jews could take out of German-controlled territories. Those willing to leave their homes were prevented from liquidating their assets to fund their escape, compounding the problem of being unwelcome around the world. In 1938, when representatives of the United States, Latin America, and Europe met in Evian, France, to negotiate havens for Jewish refugees, the outcome spelled doom for a European Jewry. Of all the Evian participants, only the Dominican Republic was willing to accept some of them. Now, let us go to another part of the world, 5,000 miles away from Europe, where there was a little-known nation that the United States had recently acquired in 1899 from Spain. As part of the closure of the Spanish-American War through the Treaty of Paris, the Philippines, together with Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam, became part of United States territory. For 333 years, a country that was whipped into docility by the Spaniards was now under American domination. The Filipinos who joined forces with the Americans to overthrow the Spaniards were a restive group, tired of being under colonial rule and tired of being oppressed. Led by ilustrados, the term used to describe the educated few among the Filipinos who were also tired of being second-class citizens in their own country, the revolutionaries continued their campaign for freedom. there was civil unrest and rebellion. Franklin Roosevelt, then President of the United States, considered these civil uprisings irksome, especially when he had to contend with a nationwide depression at home. The Americans were also fed up of hearing about this rebellion and were content to give the Philippines the independence they were asking for. It was in this political climate that a young, smart, politically savvy Filipino rose through the ranks of Philippine politics. By 1935, when Europe was becoming unbearable for the Jews, Senator Manuel Luis Quezon was elected as the first president of the Philippine Commonwealth. As an ilustrado, he was aware of the events unfolding in Europe. As a Filipino, he felt the brunt of American racial discrimination towards him and his countrymen. These social inequalities created in Quezon a strong fraternal feeling towards the Jews. What was happening in the streets of Manila was also of note. In the mid-1930s, the Filipinos, appalled by the inhumane treatment of the Jews, staged appeals and demonstrations to the government and to a newly elected president who already had a sympathetic ear. As the conditions in Europe worsened, Filipinos staged a 2,000-strong indignation rally in 1938. The Philippines and the Filipinos are known for upholding a strong humanitarian tradition of providing assistance to forcibly displaced individuals in need of protection. This nation has offered asylum to successive waves of refugees fleeing persecution since the end of World War I. Filipinos embody the spirit of compassion, solidarity, and humanity, and are quick to open their hearts and homes to refugees fleeing war and persecutions in their home countries. When word got out that the Philippines was open, thousands of Jews petitioned the United States Department for visas to Manila. The Commonwealth period was a great period politically. With the passage of the Tidings-McDuffie Act, also known as the Philippine Independence Act, the United States had promised the Philippines independence by 1945. But even while the Philippines remained American territory, the Commonwealth government had considerable political power. The president, for instance, had the authority to allow or to bar anyone to debark on Philippine soil. Moreover, through a loophole in the U.S. Immigration Act, the Philippines was exempt from the immigrant quota policy. Now, the Filipinos with large extended families also have a very strong tayo-tayo tradition. Basically, it means that when a person or group appeals for a moral need to a family or community, he or they will be taken in as a member of that family or clan. Tayo-tayo can be loosely defined as mutual helping within structured systems of interpersonal relationships and indebtedness. Being hospitable by nature, Filipinos are therefore predisposed to welcome refugees. Despite 3 centuries of Catholic monopolism, the Filipinos are remarkably tolerant, both religiously and culturally, of other people. The Jews could therefore come to the Philippines and practice their religion and cultural traditions freely. But there was one big hurdle. The United States required that the refugees should not be a burden to their host country. And within an economy that had been engineered for economic dependence on the United States, the Philippine Commonwealth could hardly afford large numbers of immigrants with scant financial means. So Quezon came up with a brilliant plan, an open-door immigration policy. Under this plan, he could purportedly bring in the needed professionals and skilled workers to fuel the Commonwealth economy. On his many leisurely evenings, playing poker with his friend Paul McNutt, the United States High Commissioner to the Philippines, he shared his views of the world with him. They were both men who understood what was happening in Europe. Quezon posed the question, could he and McNutt secure visas for up to 1 million Jewish immigrants? An unimaginably very bold move. Also, at about this time, there was concern and a movement among Jews outside Europe to aid the refugees. The Jewish community in Manila and the Joint Distribution Committee in the United States were big players in ensuring that the United States requirement was met. Quezon was already friendly with the Frieder brothers, a Jewish family from Cincinnati who had a cigar factory in the Philippines. McNutt on his part was friendly with Jacob Lees, one of his staunchest supporters and political ally. Jacob's brother Julius was very active in both the Refugee Economic Corporation and the American Jewish Distribution Committee, two organizations with a common goal of funding and supporting refuge for European Jews. Meanwhile, the Frieder brothers' cigar business was flourishing. These businessmen moved freely in the social circles of Connecticut and Manila. The five brothers and their families made frequent trips between the States and the Philippines. They were therefore able to act simultaneously on both sides of the Pacific to raise money, lobby, and negotiate bureaucratic hurdles for the refugee project. Their business also needed cigar rollers, and cigar rolling became a special skill that a refugee could apply for. It was now 1937, and immigrants were trickling in. There were critics who questioned President Quezon's open-door immigration policy. The Americans were also watching. A limit of 1,000 immigrants annually was imposed at this time by the US government. So Quezon pushed back. To keep the local critics at bay, he issued a proclamation, Proclamation number 73, which called on all Filipinos to welcome the refugees and instructing the Philippine government to assist them. He defied the US State Department and personally strategized, manipulated, and moved to have over 1,000 refugees find a new home in the Philippines. Still, this was not enough for Quezon. He had a parcel of land in Marikina, a farm just outside Manila that he had purchased with his own hard-earned money as a nest egg for his son. He offered up this land for the refugees to settle in, essentially creating the first kibbutz outside of Israel. He pushed for the admission of 30,000 more Jews and then issued Commonwealth Act number 613 favoring the refugees. It later became the basis of the Philippine Immigration Act of 1940. But Quezon's health, unfortunately, was failing, but he was driven. It was now 1938, and the Jews of Germany and Austria were being moved into ghettos. Death camps were just a heartbeat away. The USS St. Louis, carrying displaced Jews from Hamburg, was denied entry in several ports and had to return to Germany. Western Europe was in denial of what was going on, playing pacifist and calling it an internal German issue. And then Kristallnacht. The first large influx of refugees arrived from Shanghai, and it was at this juncture in history that Quezon made the lone stand of declaring the Philippines a safe haven for Jewish refugees. At a time when it would have been easier to just dismiss the distant Jewish problem as something that was not Philippine business or giving up after so many obstacles were placed his way, Quezon turned the issue into a personal crusade. Up until 1944, heading the Philippine government in exile in the United States, and before his untimely death, Quezon still wondered whether he had done enough and whether he could have done more. Despite the United States limiting him to 1,000 visas annually, he already had 30,000 on hand when the Japanese forces invaded the Philippines. He dreamt of settling these 30,000 and maybe even more Jews in Mindanao, the picturesque southern part of the Philippines. Back in the 1930s, there were about 500 Jewish families in Manila. They were a tight-knit, vibrant community whose religious life revolved around Temple Emil, a synagogue named after Emil Bachrach, the main benefactor. Most of them were prosperous businessmen or established professionals, and they were a big factor in providing and pledging support for the refugees. The newly arrived children thought it was an exciting adventure. Playing in the sands and beaches with their newly found Filipino friends are fond remembrances that up to now are recalled with affection by the Manilangers, as the refugees were called, and some of whom are still alive today. For the adults, it was a different story. The trauma was given more clarity by the unfamiliar coconut trees and the blazingly orange sunsets. They really felt displaced. But as more came and stories were shared, Jewish life in the Philippines took on a more stable form. Life was not easy, but they were safe. and this was life until 1941. But the rumblings of war went on. Japan allied with Germany and was intent on securing a route to the riches of the East Indies. The United States was regarded by the Japanese as a hindrance to this aspiration, and its forces in the areas were a threat that had to be dealt with. This led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the Philippines, being an American territory, was viciously attacked by Japan on December 8, 1941. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines had begun and did not end until July 5, 1945. The Jewish refugees were again subjected to the horrors of war. They suffered with the rest of the Manila population as the city was bombed incessantly. It is on record that Manila, next to Warsaw, was the most extensively damaged city during World War II. Together with other refugees of their adopted Filipino families and friends, the Jewish refugees did what they could to survive the Japanese occupation. By some ironic twist, when the Japanese were rounding up foreign nationals for incarceration, most of the refugees, specifically those with German passports, were left free. The Japanese ignored the big J on their passports, thought of them as Germans and therefore allies. And these refugees were the ones who found food for the incarcerated ones, became couriers, and aided in the subversive tactics of the Filipino guerrillas. Some even joined the underground. They became part of the Philippine fabric of nationalism and shared with the Filipinos the same desire for safety, peace, and freedom. Quezon was spirited to the United States for treatment of his failing health and for his safety. He worried about the Jewish refugees. Some were on their way to the Philippines when Japan invaded. Some who already had visas were trapped in war-torn Europe. And some refugees who were already in the Philippines had families who were trying to find a way to get there. Many found circuitous routes through Vladivostok, Siberia, and down to Manchuria, and then to Shanghai, where they would find a ship to take them to the Philippines. It was a trip fraught with pitfalls and danger. Quezon died in exile in 1944, and on his deathbed expressed to his wife his concern for his country and his fears for the Jewish refugees. MacArthur did return to liberate the Philippines from the Japanese on October 20, 1944, as he had promised. Manila was in shambles. The refugees had to rethink their options. Some opted to stay and carry on with their lives, choosing not to uproot their families again. Others decided to join families and friends in America. A large number of them resettled in Palestine with the hope of the State of Israel being created. And again, in this instance, the Philippines played a part. For the world to recognize Israel's existence in 1948, it was the Philippine representative to the United Nations, Carlos P. Romulo, who cast the tie-breaking vote in favor of the creation of the State of Israel. It was a vote that encouraged other countries to not be afraid and to use their conscience to support a new nation and its people. Nearly 8 decades have passed, and yet the ties that bind Israel and the Philippines are still strong. Just outside Tel Aviv, in the Holocaust Memorial Park in Rishon LeZion, there stands a monument. In 2009, this Open Doors monument was erected to commemorate a friendship. It is shaped like 3 open doors in triangular form and in increasing heights. The triangles represent the 2 triangles in the Star of David and the 1 in the Philippine flag. There are footprints of Holocaust survivors who made it to Manila on the floor. On one wall of the monument are Quezon's words of welcome to the refugees. He said, "It is my hope, and indeed my expectation, that the people of the Philippines will have in the future every reason to be glad that when the time of need came, their country was glad to extend to persecuted people a hand of welcome." Thank you. I am now ready to take your questions.
Thank you, Nina, for a wonderful presentation. It's kind of like Jewish Filipino relations history all in under half an hour. So it's a yeoman's effort to get us there. And I'm sure many of you were probably quite surprised as I was. I wanted to open up for questions. You can post them in the chat, or you can use your hand emoji, or the old-fashioned hand up will be helpful. When you do that, you can unmute yourself, and Nina will be more than happy to answer your questions. We have a few minutes to be able to share that, and Nina will be glad to engage you in your questions. So please feel free. Any questions that people have?
Nina.
Yes.
Andy has a question.
Do you have any record of how many have stayed behind and the lives and the activity of the Jews in Manila today?
Unfortunately, because of the viciousness of the bombing that went on in Manila, the records were destroyed, but Temple Emil was burnt down. And so the records of the Jews who were there was destroyed. But there, as they say, the one way of knowing what happened to them is through their gravestones. So there were a few gravestones that clearly belonged to a Jewish, it was a Jewish cemetery in the Philippines that was, strangely enough, shared with a Protestant sect. So we knew there was quite a number of them, but we cannot really establish how many, because during the American occupation, a lot of Jews also came to the Philippines for economic opportunities, and also to service the Americans who were stationed there. So we really do not know how many were left of the Jews who were saved by Quezon. We could only go by the stories told by those who were still alive when they were interviewed by these researchers. Some of them are still alive today, and actually is in Israel, and quite complementous and very helpful. So I really cannot give you a number. All I know is that there are still some of them residing in the Philippines, and one of them actually is one of her granddaughters is one of his granddaughters is now the wife of the president of the Philippines, Duterte.
Thank you.
And her name is Elizabeth Zimmerman.
Any questions?
I have another question, Nina, if there's others that are popping up right now. Andy, keep me posted if we see any other hands go up. Nina, one of the things that I'm aware of in my time in serving in the Jewish community in San Francisco was a very special community there known as the Shanghai Jewish community. And I'm wondering if you can tell us about any connection in terms of the relationship between the Shanghai Jews and what we would call the Philippine Jews, the ones that were able to find safe passage and a home in the Philippines. And why was there a difference between those two places, between Shanghai and the Philippines? And what was the sense of home in each of those places for the Jews that were fleeing?
Shanghai was a drop-off point, if you want to put it that way. The visas that were arriving in Europe at that time, because it was difficult to get the visas to the European Jews who were trying to escape. So what they would get most of the time would be an affidavit, and their visas would be waiting for them in Shanghai, which was somehow arranged for them by the Frieder brothers. The Frieder brothers were well connected, and so they would pile up a list of people that they wanted to give visas to, and they would be waiting for them in Shanghai. So it was a drop-off point, and from there, they would get the ship arranged to take them to the Philippines, where because they would already have their visa, so that they could settle in the Philippines with no problem at all. Because when they are in Shanghai, they are just there temporarily, sort of, because unless they go underground and hide, because they have no visas. So that would be one of the reasons that they were using Shanghai as a drop-off point. And Shanghai was a vibrant community too at that time, and there were a lot of Jews going there because, because of what was going on in Europe, you go to any place where you could possibly save your life. And one of the places that they could go to was Shanghai.
Rabbi, you're muted. But any questions? Anyone else would like
yeah, go ahead. Any other questions? I'll do a follow-up on Shanghai after.
What is the relationship? How would you regard the relationship of the Philippines and the Japanese today?
Because it's been a while since from the that was the 1930s, 1940s, and we are now in 2020, and the succeeding generations don't remember what it was like, how vicious the Japanese were. I got the tail end of the war, so I knew how vicious they were and how afraid the people were of the Japanese. And it sort of carried with my grandparents' generation, my mother's generation, my parents' generation, but the generation after me don't remember it that well. We have cordial relationship with Japan now.
Rabbi, you're muted. Okay.
So the follow-up question I wanted to ask you, though, Nina, in our discussion was that you mentioned that the Jewish community in the Philippines shared the rabbi from the Jewish community in Shanghai. So although it was a drop-off point, there still was enough of a need for a rabbi and for something like a Jewish community. And I know there were Torah scrolls that were saved from Shanghai. So what was the relationship in terms of the sharing of Jewish resources between Shanghai and
even before Quezon thought of saving the Jews from the Holocaust, there was already a vibrant community in Manila, and they were in need of a rabbi. In fact, they saved one rabbi's life from the Holocaust when he was recruited to be the rabbi in Manila, so that they could put down on paper that he was one of those needed for the Philippines and for the Jews in the Philippines, and he was recruited and saved his life that way. I forgot his name. I think in fact it was Glazer, if I'm not mistaken.
Mishpacha. Wow, I'll have to find out. Okay, that's fascinating.
They were able to get a cantor out, a rabbi, and a lot of doctors, a lot of cigar rollers. So suddenly they all became adept at cigar rolling. That was the only way they could be saved. So they became adept at cigar rolling. And because one of the requirements that one of the big requirements that the United States wanted was that they should not be a burden to the Philippine government. And so they were making up all of this things to make it appear that these were needed to fuel the Philippine Commonwealth. So we needed a rabbi to fuel the Philippine Commonwealth, you see, and we need a cantor to fuel the Philippine Commonwealth, the Philippine government, and the cigar rolling, of course, it's a big business. So,
Rabbi, we got the time done.
Perfect. Well, Nina, on behalf of Andy and myself and your communal family here at Sharzine and Beth-El, we want to thank you for your Maven monologue. You definitely are a Maven of a moment in history that we need to learn a lot more about. And if people are interested in learning more about it, who's the scholar or the book that you recommend people should read? Aside from your great talk, is there someone else that they should be looking at to do further reading?
There is a book by one of the Holocaust survivors. It's called Escape to Manila. It is by, I believe, he just died recently, Ephraim. He's one of the Holocaust survivors. And he wrote down his experiences, and it became a book. His family said. And there is also a documentary made by a good friend of mine who did a lot of research on this subject, and a filmmaker from the States. I don't remember exactly what part of the States, and it's called Jewish Rescue in the Philippines, An Open Door. And
Nina, I suggest you and Lou could send this information to Roseanne Puritz and our president, Suzanne Grant, and the rabbi, and then it can be put into the weekly bulletin, and people can then either purchase or go online to see what you have.
That would be wonderful. You can give us your top reading list, top book and top movie. That's a great thing to follow up on. So Nina, thank you again, and thanks to Lou
My pleasure.
for sharing his better half, because we know Lou has a better half, even though he's the best. But you're pretty amazing too. It's an incredible story, Nina, very inspiring, and we bless you and your family with nothing but health and hope and inspiring ways of telling this story so that we can learn how to all live together and to really embrace our diversity and to understand that both as a Jewish people and as a humankind, we are really one big family. So thanks again, Nina. And we look forward to our next Maven monologue, which will be, Andy, what's our next date?
Oh my goodness. You will know it's in September, and we have
a big surprise.
We know we have Doreen Brown, who's an expert in adoption law and divorce law. Not that it applies.
We're not getting divorced, but why would we be interested in this, Andy?
Oh, in the adoption law, I'll tell you why. A lot of our kids are adopting. And so new grandchildren coming into families, there is a whole new slate of adoption laws in Canada. So she will give a Maven monologue. The third one is a dear friend's daughter I've known since she was born. Heidi Small will talk about the chefs, the great chefs in Montreal, the great restaurants. And she's also talking to 200 people this Thursday in the Côte St. Luc Men's Club, the way you did, Nina, so beautifully. So thank you again.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody, for coming.